We are counting down the 10 most unforgettable celebrity moments when altered states took center stage on Johnny Carson's iconic Tonight Show. From guests who turned being high into pure television gold to live wire appearances that left the control room in chaos, each entry reveals a different side of late night's hidden risks and rapid-fire rescue tactics. So, which wild appearance tops the list? And how did Carson and his team keep the show rolling? Let's start with number 10. Every clip in this countdown comes from the archives, episodes preserved by NBC, the Paley Center, and the vast television vaults at UCLA. Where possible, original air dates and guest lists have been cross-checked against production records, TV listings, and contemporary press. Many of the most colorful backstage stories survive only through staff recollections, memoirs, and interviews collected decades later. Some details, like the idea of a secret code of host gestures or a strict green room drink limit, are widely repeated in industry lore, but do not appear in official production documents or verified staff manuals. When a moment is drawn from crew memory or fan retelling, it is labeled as such so viewers can separate what is on tape from what has become part of Tonight Show mythology. Researchers and archive partners have worked to verify every claim, but in a show with over 20,000 guest appearances, not every anecdote can be traced to a paper trail. This approach aims to honor the reality of live television. Sometimes the only record is the tape, the laughter, and the nervous glances behind the scenes. With that in mind, the countdown begins. Cheech and Tommy Chong did not just play stoners, they made it their signature. Their Tonight Show appearances in the 1970s turned the idea of being high into a running joke, with routines that poked fun at their own spaced-out personas. In one memorable segment, Cheech stares into the distance, blinking slowly, while Chong fumbles through a story about losing his car keys somewhere in the desert. The audience roars as Carson, stone-faced, deadpans a follow-up. "Do you remember where you left your shoes?" The laughter is not just at the punchline. It is at the collision of worlds on the couch. Cheech and Chong's act blurred the line between performance and reality, but insiders say their on-air haze was mostly for show. Network censors listened closely to their language, but producers allowed them to lean into the bit, so long as the antics stayed within broadcast limits. Unlike later guests whose impairment caused chaos, Cheech and Chong's high was part of the entertainment, not a backstage problem to solve. Their appearances became a kind of controlled chaos, predictable, safe, and always good for a laugh. George Carlin's Tonight Show appearances from the early 1970s offer a masterclass in improvisation under the influence. In one clip from 1973, Carlin settles into the guest chair with his trademark slouch, hair shaggy, eyes a little unfocused. Carson tosses out a simple question, something about airport security, and Carlin launches into a winding riff on metal detectors, airline food, and the existential dread of waiting for your luggage. The audience is with him every step, laughing as he pivots from punchline to punchline, never losing the thread. There is a looseness to his delivery, a rhythm that feels both spontaneous and perfectly timed. According to his memoir, Carlin was often high on marijuana during these sets, yet on tape, his wit stays razor sharp, and he never misses a cue. Producers tolerated, even embraced, Carlin's altered state because he could deliver live, night after night. Unlike later guests whose impairment derailed interviews, Carlin's on-air haze became part of the show's unpredictable charm. Dean Martin's Tonight Show visits played out like a slow-motion balancing act between persona and reality. He would wander out, tuxedo sharp, a glass in hand, and settle into the couch with a grin that dared the audience to guess how much was real. In one often cited segment from the mid-1970s, Martin aimed for the guest chair and missed by a few inches, sinking into a sheepish slouch before flashing that famous smile. The crowd erupted, but Martin just shrugged and slurred his way through a half-remembered golf story, then lost his train of thought altogether. Without missing a beat, he waved it off. Ah, who cares? It wasn't that funny anyway. Carson, ever the straight man, leaned into the moment, playing off Martin's looseness with a gentle nudge back to the script. For viewers, it was impossible to know where the act ended and the real man began. That uncertainty was part of the electricity in the studio. Was this just Dean being Dean, or had the backstage bar done its work? In those moments, the line between performance and impairment blurred, and the show leaned into the ambiguity, letting the audience in on the joke without ever spelling out the punchline. Sammy Davis Jr. brought a kind of energy to The Tonight Show that could light up the entire studio. In a 1974 appearance, he hit the stage with a grin and a pace that left even Johnny Carson scrambling to keep up. Davis barely settled into his seat before launching into rapid-fire stories, his hands in constant motion, eyes darting from the band to the audience to the host. The rhythm was relentless, jokes, impressions, and asides tumbling out in quick succession. Sweat beaded on his forehead, partly from the heat of the lights, partly from the sheer speed of his delivery. Carson, ever the seasoned host, leaned back and let Davis run, occasionally tossing in a short question or a wry smile to keep things moving. The audience responded with bursts of laughter and applause, swept up in the whirlwind. Industry insiders watching from backstage recognized the telltale signs of the era's favorite stimulant. But on tape, Davis never missed a beat. The segment stands as a clear example of how a guest's elevated state could be both a challenge and a spectacle, managed, not derailed, by Johnny Carson's steady hand. Richard Pryor's visits to The Tonight Show in the late 1970s captured the tension of live television on a knife's edge. In one especially uneasy appearance, Pryor started strong, trading jokes with Carson and flashing that razor-sharp timing. But as the segment wore on, his answers drifted, stories trailed off, and punchlines vanished mid-sentence. The studio air thickened with uncertainty. Carson, reading the moment, leaned forward and cut in with a quick question about Pryor's latest film, steering the conversation back to safer ground. Pryor latched onto the prompt, regaining his rhythm for a few minutes before slipping again into silence. Producers in the control room recognized the pattern. When a guest lost focus, Carson's job was to keep the segment afloat, sometimes tossing out rapid-fire questions, sometimes switching to gentle humor, always buying time until the next commercial break. Crew members later described these moments as a kind of live rescue operation, with Carson acting as both host and lifeguard. The audience at home rarely noticed the turbulence, but behind the scenes, every shift in tone meant directors and camera operators were on alert, ready to pivot if things unraveled. Pryor's brilliance was never in question, but on nights like this, the real show happened between the lines. In Carson's instincts, the crew's quick thinking, and the invisible choreography that kept The Tonight Show running, no matter who was on the couch. Peter Fonda's 1970 appearance on The Tonight Show lives on in backstage stories more than in broadcast records. Clips from that night are hard to come by, and what survives is a patchwork of recollections and second-hand accounts. Crew members described Fonda as unusually distracted, staring into the studio lights, then at his own hands, before snapping back to answer Carson's questions. The conversation drifted quickly from Hollywood projects to musings about the nature of time, and Fonda launched into a monologue about how time is not linear, leaving Carson to guide him gently back to Earth. Some staffers later claimed his pupils were enormous, and the control room debated cutting to commercial early. There is no official production log confirming this, and no surviving memo about a segment cut short. What is clear from the available evidence is that Fonda's on-air presence felt unpredictable, even by the loose standards of the era. Whether he was truly under the influence of psychedelics that night remains unproven, but the ripple effect through the crew is well remembered. The Fonda episode stands as a classic example of Tonight Show lore, where the line between fact and legend is as blurry as the guest's own memory. Truman Capote's January 1980 Tonight Show appearance stands out as a cautionary tale, preserved in a few uneasy minutes of broadcast tape. Capote, celebrated for his literary genius and infamous for his late-night exploits, slumped into the guest chair, words tumbling out in a barely decipherable slur. His head bobbed forward, only to snap back up with a dazed blink, as if fighting to stay present. The audience's laughter faded into awkward silence, leaving Johnny Carson to fill the gaps with a strained smile and gentle redirects. In the control room, directors cut repeatedly to Carson's face, searching for a safe out. Staffers later recalled the tension as Capote rambled, the segment dragging far beyond comfort. When the commercial finally arrived, Carson reportedly turned to his talent coordinator and said, "Never again." Capote would never return to The Tonight Show. The fallout from that night set an unspoken boundary. Charm or chaos might be tolerated, but outright disrespect for the audience's time and the show's reputation crossed a line that was rarely forgiven. Oliver Reed's Tonight Show appearance in 1975 stands as a rare moment when the room's easy chaos turned genuinely tense. Reed, already infamous in British television circles for his wild, unpredictable energy, arrived on set visibly intoxicated. The interview began with loud, boisterous laughter, but Reed's volume kept climbing. He shifted in his seat, gesturing with broad, unsteady sweeps, and at one point rose abruptly, demonstrating what he called a proper fighting stance. Carson's posture changed, no longer leaning in, but sitting back, eyes narrowed, measuring the risk. Security staff edged closer to the stage, a precaution rarely needed but understood by those who worked the floor. The control room responded in real time, cutting away from Reed's movements to wider shots, then to Carson's steady, unflinching gaze. Within minutes, the segment was cut short. The next guest ushered on without explanation. Reed was never invited back. For Carson, physical aggression, real or threatened, was the one boundary that could not be crossed. The broadcast did not linger on the chaos, but behind the scenes the message was clear. Some lines once crossed meant the door stayed closed for good. Orson Welles brought a different kind of unpredictability to the Tonight Show stage. In a now famous clip from a mid-1970s appearance, Welles launches into a story about magic and Hollywood, his voice booming, his gestures grand, a glass of wine never far from reach. The conversation takes a sharp turn as Welles interrupts Johnny Carson and veers into a monologue about illusion and the nature of truth. Carson sits back, letting Welles command the room, but he glances to the band and shuffles his blue cards, small signs that the host is recalibrating in real time. Crew members later described these moments as a test of the show's flexibility. Welles could be mesmerizing, but also impossible to steer. The press at the time called it a performance within a performance, with newspapers noting how Welles seemed to drift between clarity and theatrical excess. For the production team, the question was not always whether a guest was impaired, but whether the segment could be contained. Welles embodied the gray area between genius and chaos, leaving the audience and the crew guessing which version of him would show up each night. Mickey Rooney's later Tonight Show appearances reveal a different side of the celebrity countdown, one that is less about spectacle and more about the toll of a long public life. In a brief archival clip from the early 1980s, Rooney sits across from Johnny Carson, his voice wavering as he tries to recall a story from his early days in Hollywood. The words come slowly, sometimes out of order, and Carson, always attentive, offers gentle prompts to help him along. Laughter drifts in from the audience, but it is softer, tinged with a sense of concern. Rooney, once the biggest box office star in America, looks smaller under the studio lights, his energy flickering between bursts of old showbiz charm and moments of confusion. Industry veterans watching from backstage recognize the signs. A performer whose years in the spotlight had left scars and who sometimes relied on more than just nerves to get through a live segment. For the crew, these moments were not punchlines. They were reminders of the risks that came with live television and the responsibility to treat even the most troubled guests with care. Rooney's appearances linger in the archives as a testament not just to the chaos of the Tonight Show couch, but to the vulnerability behind the bravado. Stagehands, makeup artists, and production assistants saw The Tonight Show from a vantage point few others shared. One former PA remembers the pre-show nerves radiating from behind the dressing room doors, with big-name guests pacing or cracking jokes just to keep their hands steady. A wardrobe assistant from the Burbank years tells of smoothing lapels and catching the faint scent of whiskey or cologne, sometimes both, as stars waited for their cue. The green room's reputation was well-earned. Staff recall bottles tucked discreetly behind the coffee urn, and the occasional glass refilled with a wink from an entourage member. For some, a quick check-in before showtime meant scanning for slurred speech or a glassy stare, subtle signs that a guest might need extra watching once the lights went up. Pages learned to read the room fast. A performer who avoided eye contact or who suddenly became too friendly might be flagged quietly to a segment producer. These lived in details, passed down in staff interviews and memoirs, paint a picture of a backstage world where everyone had a role in keeping the show on track. If a guest was off, it was often the youngest staffer who first noticed and the quickest to pass along a warning before the curtain rose. On a night when a guest began stumbling over words and drifting off mid-answer, the control room braced for trouble. As the segment unraveled, a director called for a wide shot, pulling focus away from the guest's confusion and onto Johnny Carson's steady presence at the desk. Crew members later described how the team watched for subtle cues, an extra shuffle of blue cards, a certain look from Johnny, then acted fast to keep the show on track. In those moments, the director's voice crackled through headsets saying, "Go to Johnny, stand by commercial." The audience at home might catch a sudden cut to Carson's wry smile or a band member's raised eyebrow, but the real rescue happened behind the scenes. Sometimes a commercial break arrived earlier than planned, buying everyone time to regroup. There is no surviving manual that spells out these moves. Instead, the evidence lives in the broadcast itself, those abrupt transitions, the quick pivots, and the seamless recovery that kept The Tonight Show running even when a guest veered off script. Live television left no room for hesitation, and the crew's unspoken choreography became its own kind of safety net. Every night in Burbank, The Tonight Show crew faced a silent calculus. How much unpredictability could they manage before the broadcast slipped out of control? Over time, staff developed a mental spectrum for guest impairment, an unwritten scale that sorted each situation into categories, each with its own playbook. At one end were the functional performers, guests who arrived a little loose but still sharp, quick with a joke and never missing a cue. These were the manageable cases. A little extra vigilance from the control room, maybe a few more reaction shots, and the show went on. In the middle sat the wild cards, guests who might veer off script, answer a question with a story that wandered nowhere, or forget they were on live television. Here the director kept a finger on the commercial button, and producers watched for any sign that a segment needed to be cut short. At the far end were the guests who crossed the line into chaos, slurred speech, missed cues, or behavior that made the studio tense. For those, the only options were to pivot fast, call an early break, or quietly decide that tonight would be their last invitation. The spectrum was not written down, but everyone backstage knew it by heart. The goal was always the same: protect the broadcast and preserve the guest's dignity, and never let the audience see just how close things sometimes came to falling apart. When a guest segment spiraled out of control, The Tonight Show's backstage machine snapped into action. Talent coordinators huddled near the phones, quietly alerting the next guest that their spot might be moved up or extended. Production assistants scrambled to adjust cue cards and rebrief the band, sometimes with only seconds' notice. If a segment ran short because of a meltdown, the control room signaled the writers to deliver an extra joke or sketch for Carson to fill the gap. Meanwhile, public relations staff weighed how to handle the inevitable calls from reporters and network executives. Sometimes a press release was drafted before the end of the taping, carefully worded to downplay the chaos without naming names. In the days that followed, booking logs were quietly updated. Some guests were marked with a discreet note that read, "Not for future consideration." Others entered what staff called Carson Purgatory, not officially banned, but never called again. The process rarely left a paper trail. For the team behind the scenes, managing a disaster was part of the job, a nightly exercise in protecting both the show's reputation and the dignity of its guests. Every decision, from shuffling the lineup to fielding press inquiries, was made on the fly. It was proof that live television left no time for second chances. In the 1970s, late-night television became a mirror for the country's changing social rules. By the time Johnny Carson moved The Tonight Show to Burbank, the line between public and private behavior had blurred, especially for celebrities. Nightclubs like Studio 54 set the tone, where stars and executives mingled in a haze of cocktails, cocaine, and late-night bravado. In Hollywood, actors and musicians often arrived at television studios straight from parties or after-hours bars, carrying the night's energy and sometimes its substances onto the set. Media historians point out that The Tonight Show's live-to-tape format left little room for error. There was no safety net. If a guest stumbled, the moment went out to millions. Yet what would have been a career-ending scandal in 1962, a slurred answer, a wandering story, a joke about being high, became almost routine by the middle of the decade. The culture didn't just tolerate looseness, it celebrated stars who seemed authentic, even if that meant unpredictable. The Tonight Show became both a stage and a pressure cooker, where the expectations of live television collided with a new era's anything-goes attitude. In this environment, managing chaos wasn't just a backstage job, it was part of the performance itself. Directors on The Tonight Show didn't wait for chaos to unfold. They acted fast, often within seconds, when a guest's behavior threatened to derail the broadcast. One of the simplest, most effective tricks in their toolkit was the wide shot. When a guest began to unravel, slurring, gesturing wildly, or losing the thread of conversation, the director called for a quick switch from a close-up to a wider camera angle. This maneuver instantly shifted focus from the guest's struggle to the reassuring presence of Johnny Carson at his desk. The audience at home might not notice the change, but behind the scenes it was a deliberate move. The wider frame softened awkward moments, made it harder to fixate on a guest's discomfort, and gave Carson more visual control of the segment. Crew members listened for subtle cues over headsets, a certain tone in the director's voice, a quick instruction to camera operators, and executed the change almost reflexively. This wasn't about hiding mistakes. It was about keeping the show's rhythm intact, protecting both the guest's dignity and the audience's experience. In a live-to-tape environment where every second counted, one well-timed wide shot could mean the difference between a segment remembered for its comedy and one remembered for its disaster. A live television show is more than a stage for celebrities. It is a high-wire act, where every stumble or unscripted moment is broadcast to millions. In the era of Johnny Carson, The Tonight Show became a place where the boundaries between performance and personal struggle often blurred. For some guests, a little looseness added to the charm. For others, it revealed the weight of expectation and the cost of constant scrutiny. Watching these segments now, it is easy to laugh or wince at the chaos on the couch, but behind every awkward pause or rambling story was a real person facing the pressures of fame, live lights, and public judgment. The culture of the time made it easy to reach for a drink or something stronger before walking on stage, and the show producers learned to adapt, protect, and sometimes quietly intervene. Rather than seeing these moments as punchlines or cautionary tales, they invite a different kind of viewing, one that recognizes both the entertainment and the vulnerability on display. The Tonight Show's legacy is not just about the laughs or the legends, but about the humanity that surfaced, sometimes unguarded, in front of the camera. On any given night, The Tonight Show could swing from polished comedy to unpredictable spectacle in a matter of seconds. The archive is crowded with moments that feel both electric and uneasy. Carson's steady hand kept the broadcast on track, while guests teetered between brilliance and collapse. Behind every legendary clip is a web of quick decisions, whispered warnings, and an unspoken agreement that live television is as much a rescue as it is entertainment. The show's legacy is not built on chaos alone, but on the craft it took to manage it. Directors could switch shots at a glance. Production assistants learned to read a guest's mood, and the host knew when to lean in and when to let a moment pass without comment. These stories, preserved on tape and in memory, offer more than just laughs. They reveal the costs and the responsibilities of making live television in an era when anything might happen. For those who want to dig deeper, credits and sources scroll below, inviting a closer look at the history behind the headlines. The real lesson of Carson's Tonight Show lives in the tension between spectacle and care, and in the skill it took to recover when a moment almost went too far. Across all 10 entries, one truth emerges. The Tonight Show mirrored America's shifting boundaries between entertainment and excess. Carson's tightrope act, balancing unpredictable celebrities and live television, revealed that fame often came with hidden costs. The code signals, whispered warnings, and last-minute pivots were not just backstage lore, they were survival tactics. In the spotlight, the line between brilliance and disaster was always razor-thin. That risk is what made late night truly electric, and why its legacy still fascinates today.